a few minutes. Um, so we are still on chapter 9. And chapter 9 is the longest chapter in this book. It's a pivotal chapter. It introduces a lot of important themes as it's related to this particular book. And I would say that some of the more important themes, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there's so much to it, and I would just encourage you to go back over to chapter 9 part 1, chapter 9 part 2, and now we're on chapter 9 part 3. But in this chapter, the main character meets a guy named George MacDonald. George MacDonald in Lewis's life was a mentor of his, a person who really impacted his Christian faith. And so Lewis actually writes George MacDonald into this chapter and into this book. And really, honors a person that was a mentor to him. And MacDonald in this book takes on a primary role in terms of guiding this main character who, as you will recall, is nameless. And in terms of understanding the nature of heaven and the nature of hell, and how and why it is that people end up in one or the other. So one of the primary themes, and I've talked about this a good bit, but I think it's just so helpful to understand that it's a fascinating thought that where he says basically, that for those people in this conversation he has with MacDonald, for those people who become Christian and who live a Christian life and who grow in that faith, that as they advance in life and then as they die and go into heaven, they will look back, and to them, because they've participated in heavenly things, it will be as if they had always been in heaven to a certain degree, and it was culminated with their death and presence in heaven. And that for those who are in hell, who remain unrepentant and rebellious, who participate in rebellious and unrepentant things, that when they end up in hell, they will look back from the finalization of having been put in hell. They will look back and see or perceive that they've always been in hell because the whole of their earthly life they participated in hellish things. So I think that that's a fascinating idea, and I think that there's probably some truth to that. So then, as the chapter progresses, we encounter where he talks about the nature of heaven and hell itself. And again, I'm just not going to go into much of that. I'm just trying to see here if there's so why do people, and this is I think maybe the most important theme out of that section. So why do people choose hell over choosing heaven? And MacDonald cites John Milton in his poem, his expansive poem, Paradise Lost, where Milton portrays Satan in this way, that the reason why Satan chose hell over heaven was because in Satan's mind, it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And so it is with humanity, that the reason why we can't choose heaven, the reason why hellish things are more appealing, is because it appeals to our autonomy, our self-rule, that we want what we want. And if that means risking hell in the process, then so be it. And so there are certain things that we absolutely refuse to give up. And so he goes on to say that that you can have a person who can give up almost anything, but there's that one thing that they cannot give up. Just that one thing. They refuse to surrender. And that is what contaminates, that is what corrupts them, and that is what ultimately prevents their ability to get into heaven, because they want what they want, even when it flies in the face of Jesus Christ and what he calls us to be and to do. So so then I think that's, one of the primary themes in this section, this part of chapter 9, that we can look at. Now, I am going to back up just a little bit and for the latter portion of this chapter. So I'm going to go, and I'm on page 74, 75. And by the way, if any of you are joining us late, this is the book that I have. Let's see if I get it without the. This is it's purple, and it is the. Let's see, what edition is this? This is a Harper's Collins book. So, and it was the 2001 edition. So I like this one the best of all the editions that I've used so far. I think that the preface and all that kind of stuff is just really helpful. So anyway, so then let me just go back to your page 74. So moved by the desire to change the subject, because he's talking about something that's uncomfortable for the main character, MacDonald is. Moved by the desire to change the subject, the main character said, I asked why the solid people, since they were full of love, did not go down into hell to rescue the ghosts, people like he is. Why were they content simply to meet them out on the plain? Would one have expected a more militant charity? Why not invade hell and rescue these people? You will understand that better, perhaps, before you go, he said. In the meantime, I must tell you, they have come further for the sake of the ghost than you can understand. So these bright people have been well on their way to deep heaven and turned around because somebody they knew had just gotten off the omnibus, and they went back to try and convince them to stay into heaven rather than go back to hell. Every one of us lives only to journey further and further into the mountains. Every one of us has interrupted that journey and retraced immeasurable distances to come down today on the mere chance of saving some ghost. Of course, it is always a joy to do so, but you cannot blame us for that. And it would be no use to come further, even if it were possible. So he's hinting here that it's really not even possible to go back to hell, even though they are much bigger and greater and stronger than anyone who comes out of hell. The sane would do no good if they made themselves mad to help madmen. But what of the poor ghosts who never get into the omnibus at all? Everyone who wishes it does. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." This is one of Lewis's most famous quotes, and it has monumental, ominous overtones to it. So it is really a very powerful, observation. So I'll read it again. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done." God, whatever you want, may your will be done. I've lived my life, but I've lived my life so that your will would be done in my life. And those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." You wanted to rule your life. You wanted to be in charge. You wanted to be autonomous. You wanted to make your own decisions. You wanted to ignore me. You didn't want to follow my commands, but your own. So your will be done. And this is the result of your will. Hell. So, without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. Those who knock, it is opened. At this moment, we were suddenly interrupted by a thin voice of a ghost talking with an enormous speed. Looking behind us, we saw the creature. It was addressing one of the solid people and was doing so too busily to notice us. Every now and then, the solid spirit tried to get a word in, but without success. The ghost's talk was like this. Oh, my dear, I've had such a dreadful time. I don't know how I will ever get here at all. I was coming with Eleanor Stone, and we had arranged the whole thing, and we were to meet at the corner of Sink Street. I made it perfectly plain because I know what she was like, and I told her once, and I told her 100 times, I would not meet her outside that dreadful Marjorie Banks woman's house, not after the way she treated me. That was one of the most dreadful things that ever happened to me. I've been dying to tell you because I felt sure you'd tell me I acted rightly. No, wait a moment, dear. Wait till I have told you. I've tried living with her when I first came, and it was all fixed up. She was to do the cooking, I was to look after the house, and I did think I was going to be comfortable after all I had been through. But she turns out to have changed. Absolutely selfish, and not a particle of sympathy for anyone but herself. And, as I once said to her, I do think I'm entitled to a little consideration because at least you lived out your time. But I oughtn't to have been here for years and years yet. Oh well, but of course, I'm forgetting you don't know. I was murdered. Simply murdered, dear. That man should have never operated. I ought to be alive today. They simply starved me in that dreadful nursing home, and no one ever came near me, and no one ever came near me. And the shrill, monotonous whine died away as the speaker, still accompanied by the bright presence at her side, moved out of hearing. What troubles you, son? Said my teacher. I am troubled, sir, said I, because that unhappy creature doesn't seem to me to be the sort of soul that ought to be even in danger of damnation. She isn't wicked. She's only a silly, garrulous old woman who has got into a habit of grumbling and feels that a little kindness and rest and change would do her all right. So Lewis is introducing here, like what about these people? I mean, they're not really horrible people, but they're still in hell. What? Why would they be damned? Why would they go to hell? Like, what's the big deal here? That is what she once was, says MacDonald. That is maybe what she still is. If so, she certainly will be cured. But the whole question is whether she is now a grumbler. I should have thought that there was no doubt about that, said the main character. But you misunderstand me. The question whether she is a grumbler or only a grumble. If there is a real woman, even the least trace of one still inside the grumbling, it can be brought to life again. If there's one wee spark under all those ashes, we'll blow it till the whole pile is red and clear. But if there's nothing but ashes, we will not go on blowing them in our own eyes forever. They must be swept up. But how can there be a grumble without a grumbler? The whole difficulty of understanding hell is that the thing to be understood is so nearly nothing. But you have had experiences. It begins with a grumbling mood, and yourself still distinct from it, perhaps criticizing it. And yourself, in a dark hour, may will that mood and embrace it. You can repent and come out of it again. There may come a day when you can do that no longer. Then there will be no you left to criticize the mood. nor even to enjoy it, but just the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. So he introduces here, another one of the primary themes. And so the theory here that he's pushing forward, and again, it just seems to make so much sense, is that for those people who end up in hell, that when they end up in hell, there is nothing left of their humanity. There is nothing left of their humanity. That it's that they have become the essence of a primary sin. So this woman here, the thought, as the thought goes, she is a grumbler. But has she grumbled so much in her life that she has become the grumble itself? So when she was a grumbler, she could look back and say, boy, I really grumbled a lot today. I was just really out of control. I need to get a better sense of how it is that I speak to people and talk with them and don't complain so much. And so when we can do that, there's still some of our humanity left, some of our humanity that can be saved. But when we grumble so much that we become the grumble itself, then things are different. Then we have become the sin itself. And it's not just grumble. It can be lust. It can be hate. It can be arrogance. It can be any of those things that utterly consume us. It might even be able to be a number of things that consume us, so that there's nothing left redemptively in us to be saved. That those people who end up in hell are the essence of their sin. So again, there might be some theological problems with that, but part of it just really seems to make a lot of sense. And it seems to make a lot of sense because the more embedded our sin becomes in us, the more difficult it is for us to repent from it. The more we build our lives and our thinking apparatus around a particular kind of sin or the practice of sin, the more difficult it becomes to see it as a problem. So, we become codependent on the sin itself. Our whole lives, how we spend our money, how we spend our time, the friends that we pick, the kind of work that we do, all of that begins to be built around and shaped by that particular sin. And so, it seems to me that, at least on that level, it makes just a lot of sense. And why we should be very careful when we don't regularly repent. That the lack of intentional repentance gives implicit permission for certain sins to continue to reside and exist in our lives and to grow. And we always need to remember that sin breeds sin. Sin is always perpetually pregnant with yet still more sins and more variations of sins. That when we allow certain sins to go unaddressed in our life, that those sins become deeply rooted and they begin to change our spiritual DNA. And we're just made over. And so the antecedent to that, of being made over into sin, is being made over into Christ. So the more that we engage Christ, the more that we follow him, the more that we read about him, the more that we pray to him, the more that we enjoy his presence, the more we become like him. And so if that is true, then the reverse is true. And so that is what I think Lewis is trying to get to through these main characters. And again, so it has a kind of ominousness to it. So, we go from, this idea of heaven and hell working backwards to, to why people choose to stay in heaven or to stay in hell, because it all depends on whether you want to serve or whether you want to rule. And now we come to this. This is very much as a very strong spiritual formation component to it. That we come to this thing here where unrepentant sin, unresolved sin, turns us into the sin that we are unrepentant of. It's a terrifying thought, really. So then we go on and says, but come, you are here to watch and listen. Lean on my arm, and we will go for a little walk. The main character says, I obeyed. To lean on the arm of someone older than myself was an experience that carried me back to childhood. And with this support, I found the going tolerable, so much so, indeed, that I flattered myself for feet were already growing more solid. Remember, they're in heaven, which is much more solid, much more substantial, and they are just wraiths. And so grass on the bottom of their feet there is like diamonds. And so until they grow more solid through gradual repentance, they remain very vulnerable and very fragile in this incredibly substantive world in which they are now find themselves. So that's his experience here, just as a reminder. So anyway, he says, I flattered myself that my feet were already growing more solid, until a glance at the poor transparent shapes convinced me that I owed all this ease to the strong arm of the teacher. Perhaps it was because of his presence that my other senses also appeared to be quickened. I noticed scents in the air, which had hitherto escaped me, and the country put on new beauties. There was water everywhere, and tiny flowers quivering in the early breeze. Far off in the woods we saw the deer glancing past, and once a sleek panther came purring to my companion's side. We also saw many ghosts. I think the most pitiable was a female ghost. Her trouble was the very opposite of that which afflicted the other, the lady frightened by the unicorns. This one seemed quite unaware of her phantasmal appearance. More than one of the solid people tried to talk to her. At first, I was quite at a loss to understand her behavior to them. She appeared to be contorting her all but invisible face and writhing her smoke-like body in a quite meaningless fashion. At last I came to the conclusion, incredible as it seemed, that she supposed herself still capable of attracting them and was trying to do so. She was a thing that had become incapable of conceiving conversation save as a means to that end. If a corpse already liquid with decay had arisen from the coffin, smeared its gums with lipstick, and attempted a flirtation, the result could not have been more appalling. In the end, she muttered, "Stupid creatures," and turned back to the bus. So here is the example that we're talking about, that here this woman was apparently in her life was the kind of person that was just very much into her own sexuality and was promiscuous, and her whole identity, her entire identity, was wrapped up in her ability to attract and maybe to seduce males while on earth. That her whole sense of self-worth was all in her ability to successfully do that. And so she was so contorted by that even in heaven, she would try and seduce these bright people, believing that she could be attracted, that they could be attracted to her. So the description that Lewis gives here is really grotesque, but I'll read it again. So imagine whether you're a male or a female, and seeing the opposite sex do the following. If a corpse, already liquid with decay, had arisen from the coffin, smeared its gums with lipstick, and attempted a flirtation, the result could not have been more appalling. So you can picture this disgusting creature contorting herself and moving in such a way that she was trying to be attractive to these bright people who were what's the word I'm looking for? Who could not be compromised. They were unimpeachable in terms of their character at this point. So this is what happens to a person when they are unrepentant. This is the absurdity. This is how ridiculous they can look in the light of heaven itself. This put me in mind to ask my teacher what he thought of the affair with the unicorns. The unicorns in an earlier chapter were used to try and scare a person out of their own self-absorption. So he's asking about that now. And so MacDonald replies, "It will maybe have succeeded," he said. "You will have divined that he meant to frighten her. Not that fear itself could make her less a ghost, but if it took her mind a moment off of herself, there might, in that moment, be a chance. I have seen them saved so." So we met several ghosts, he goes on to say, we have met several ghosts that had come so near to heaven only in order to tell the celestials about hell. We have met several ghosts that have come so near to heaven only in order to tell the celestials about hell. Indeed, this is one of the commonest types. Others, who had perhaps been, like myself, teachers of some kind, actually wanted to give lectures about it. They brought notebooks full of statistics and maps, and one of them, a magic lantern. Some wanted to tell anecdotes of the notorious sinners of all ages whom they had met below, but the most part seemed to think that the mere fact of having contrived for themselves so much misery gave them some kind of superiority. This is an interesting thought. Now, I mean, there are all kinds of applications to this idea, but you know, it kind of feeds into the whole idea of intersectionality. If you know what intersectionality is, that if you are a kind of minority, then you have been victimized. And if you are two kinds of a minority, if you are a woman and you're an African American, then you have been doubly victimized. And if you are a woman who's African American who is transsexual, then you have been triply victimized. And so there's the whole idea of intersectionality is the person who has who can claim the most kinds of injustices related to their minority status, or the kinds or numbers of minorities statuses that they have more authority than a person like, say, a straight white male. Straight white males have no authority to speak about justice or social justice. Only those people who can claim the most number of an intersectional status. So in this way, it's kind of similar that these people come up out of hell and they've experienced tremendous misery down there. And so they want to tell everybody about that up in heaven, about all the misery and the more miseries that they have, the more moral superiority they have because they experienced something that nobody else did. So it's that kind of a thing that's going on here. But again, he's alluding to these people who are so invested in their sin that there isn't anything left, that they're so invested in their sin that they feel morally superior to those people in heaven itself, because their misery is greater, and because their misery is greater, and because they've suffered more, they have more moral authority, which is, it's the exact opposite of how it should be. But the most part seem to think that the mere fact of having contrived for themselves so much misery gave them a kind of superiority. I remember years ago, back in 2002, when I sat in on a scholars seminar at Whitworth College for a month, that we were studying genocide, just the phenomenon of genocide globally. And so there was one woman there who was a process theologian who was from Pittsburgh Theological. And she, when she did her presentation, we were all supposed to do presentations. When she did her presentation about the suffering of people and the fact that she was speaking on behalf of those who suffered from genocide, so she was advocating on their behalf. She said this. She said this as an advocate for those who have suffered, and as a result, because she has suffered by studying their suffering, she said that God would have to give an account about why he would be held accountable about why he allowed so much suffering in the world. So she took the high ground. She felt morally superior to God because she knew better what to do with humanity than what God allowed. So those of us who were more conservative in our theology thought, well, good luck with that. Good luck with holding God accountable. And, that's part of the sovereignty of God, right? Part of the sovereignty of God is that there's an overarching plan and purpose for why the world is the way the world is, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that because God is all loving and good, he allows humankind to be autonomous. So if God interfered in our capacity to commit evil, we would not be autonomous. And by extension, we would not be able to reject our evil and choose to love him, because God's controlling all of that. The only way to control the evil in the world is for God to fully control humankind. If God fully controlled humankind, then our love for him would be forced. It would not be sincere. So in order for our love to be sincere and in order for us to be truly autonomous, he gives us the freedom to do what we do. And the truth of the matter is that too many of us in our autonomy choose to do evil things, which causes suffering. And that those of us who can choose to stop evil, choose not to stop evil, and we enable suffering. So, so there's all of that that goes on here. And so in response to that other professor who was teaching at Pittsburgh Theological, that's what we were thinking. She wanted to take the moral high ground because God had obviously failed in the suffering of human being and stopping the suffering of humanity. When in reality, she just couldn't look at herself in the mirror and understand that the suffering that takes place in the world is of our own making. Could God stop it? Yes, but then the whole program changes, and we are no longer autonomous human beings. We are just automatons. We're just mindless puppets, and that's not what we were created to be. So he goes on to say, "You have led a sheltered life," they bawled. "You don't know the seamy side." This is the people who come up out of hell. "We will tell you. We will give you some hard facts," as if to tinge heaven with infernal images. And Keller's had been the only purpose for which they came. So they wanted to corrupt heaven. They wanted to contort heaven and make heaven feel badly about the way it was. So So all alike, so far as I could judge from my own exploration of the lower world, were never wholly unreliable and all equally incurious about the country in which they had arrived. They repelled every attempt to teach them, and when they found that nobody listened to them, they went back, one by one, to the bus, back to hell. This curious wish to describe hell turned out, however, to be only the mildest form of a desire very common among the ghosts. And that was the desire to extend hell, to bring it bodily, if they could, into heaven. There were tub-thumping ghosts who, in thin, bat-like voices, urged the blessed spirits to shake off their fetters, to escape from their imprisonment of happiness, to tear down the mountains with their hands, to seize heaven for their own. Hell offered her cooperation. And so there were some people who came up out of the bus, and these are truly evil people, who wanted to assault heaven, who wanted to extend hell into heaven, and to repurpose the essence of heaven into hell itself. So there are people like that in real life, aren't there? They are that evil that they are so invested in what they do and believe that is evil that they want to extend it. They believe that it's what. So so there are probably numerous examples of that, in pop culture, none of which come to mind. If I can think of one, I will tell you. But that's kind of what is going on here. So he goes on to say, there were planning ghosts. So he's talking about all the different kinds of ghosts that came up out of hell into heaven. These are sort of the typologies that were of the ghosts that came up. There were planning ghosts who implored them to dam the river, cut down the trees, kill the animals, build a mountain railway, smooth out the horrible grass and moss and heather with asphalt. There were the materialistic ghosts who informed the immortals that they were deluded. There was no life after death, and this whole country was a hallucination. So, so he gets at the different types of people on earth who become the essence of their sin, who end up in hell. And if they had a chance to go back into hell, if they had a chance to leave hell as they were and go into heaven, these are the things that they would do. They are so invested. They have been so corrupted. They are the essence of demons. They are the essence of people who co-opt everything else for their own purpose. They are the essence of people that would cut down trees and kill animals, and so this progress kind of thing. The materialistic ghosts were so invested. There's no, they're so deluded by their belief in materialism that they can't even recognize hell, let alone heaven, as being real in some respects. There were ghosts, plain and simple, mere bogies, fully conscious of their own decay, who had accepted the traditional role of the specter and seemed to hope they could frighten someone. So they knew that they were hellish, and they would go to heaven just to try and scare people, which was utterly impossible. I had no idea that this desire was possible, but my teacher reminded me that the pleasure of frightening is by no means unknown on earth, and also of Tacitus saying, they terrify lest they should fear. So, so they distract themselves with terror lest they come to terms with what they should be really afraid of. When the debris of a decayed human soul finds itself crumbled into ghosthood and realizes, quote, I myself am now that which all humanity has feared. I am just that old churchyard shadow, that horrible thing which cannot be, yet somehow is. Then to terrify others appears to it an escape from the doom of being a ghost, yet still fearing ghosts, fearing even the ghost it is. For to be afraid of oneself is the last horror. To be afraid of oneself is the last horror. So they go on to say, but beyond all these, I saw other grotesque phantoms in which hardly a trace of the human form remained. Monsters who had faced the journey to the bus stop perhaps for them to the bus stop, perhaps for them was 1,000 miles, and come up to the country of the shadow of life, and limped far into it over the torturing grass, only to spit and gibber out in one ecstasy of hatred their envy, and what is harder to understand, their contempt of joy. So this whole section then is describing the nature, the kind of what once were humans, and how evil had contorted and changed and corrupted them into these kinds of images that were completely deluded, that had no capacity for understanding heaven for what it was, or could embrace heaven for what it would give. They were completely and totally gone. And these are the kinds of things that are in store for people who remain unrepentant, and who do not exercise, and who may not exercise repentance on a regular basis, because the less we repent, the more hellish we can become. And the more hellish we can become, the more possible it can be for us to become any of these kinds of creatures that Lewis is describing in this book. Truly a terrifying and ominous thing. It goes on to say, the void seemed to them a small price to pay if once, only once, within sight of that eternal dawn, they could tell the prigs, the toffs, the sanctimonious humbugs, the snobs, the haves, what they thought of them. So they only came up to heaven just to give them a piece of whatever mind they had. How did they come to be here at all? I asked my teacher. I have seen that kind converted, said he, when those you would think less deeply damned have gone back. Those that hate goodness are sometimes nearer than those that know nothing at all about it and think they have it already. This is a complex thought, and I don't know that I have a lot of time to go into this, but one of the examples I could give to you would be a person who is fixated on what justice is. So they have this idea of justice and this very strong sense of rightness and wrongness. The problem is that the optic is off. It's not balanced, and so the kind of justice they pursue is it's driven by their sense of rightness and wrongness, but the application is way off. And sometimes those people can do horrible things in the name of justice. But when they encounter God and his sense of justice, they shift. So they look like it can look like that the things that they're doing in the name of justice are absolutely horrible, and you think hellish. But when they encounter, so it's like, let me see, it's like a piece of machinery that ought to be in a groove, right? But it's not. It's outside the groove, and that machinery is still working, but it causes great damage and makes a horrible sound. But if you can push that piece of machinery back into its groove where it was designed to be, then the machinery returns to normal and functions as it should. It sounds horrible initially. It sounds like it's about to just completely fall apart, and you think there's that piece of machinery is beyond fixing. Listen to it, watch it. But a slight tap, a bump, puts it into the place where it needs to be, and now it runs perfectly. I think that's the kind of thing that he's talking about there. that there are some people who can look like they are so incredibly off, but in reality, they may be closer than what you think. I think that people who are fixated on theodicy, like if God is so good, why does he allow, if God is all good and all powerful, why does he allow hell? Or why does he allow evil to prevail? They just have a very strong sense of rightness and goodness. But their perspective is off. And if you can shift that perspective, they fall in line, and now it makes all the sense of the world to them. I think that's the kind of thing that they're talking about. "Quiet now," said my teacher suddenly. We were standing close to some bushes, and beyond that I saw one of the solid people and a ghost who had apparently just that moment met. The outlines of the ghost looked vaguely familiar, but I soon realized that what I had seen on Earth was not the man himself, but photographs of him in the papers. He had been a famous artist. "God," said the ghost, glancing around the landscape. "God what?" asked the spirit. "What do you mean, God what?" asked the ghost. "In our grammar, God is a noun." "Oh, I see. I don't mean by gum or something that the sort. I meant, well, all this, it's, I should like to paint this." "I shouldn't bother about that just at the present if I were you," said the spirit. "Look here. Isn't one going to be allowed to go on painting? Looking comes first." "But I've had my look. I've just seen what I want to do. God, I wish I thought I'd bring all my things with me." The spirit shook his head, scattering light from his hair as he did so. "That sort of thing's no good here," he said. "What do you mean?" said the ghost. "When you painted on Earth, at least in your earlier days, it was because you caught glimpses of heaven in the earthly landscape. The success of your painting was that it enabled others to see the glimpses too. But here, you are having the thing itself. It is from here that the messages came. There is no good telling us about this country, for we see it already. In fact, we see it better than you do." So this would be one of the statements where people who would say that Lewis is Platonic, this would be one of the primary statements that that he may be a bit of a dualist in a Greek Platonic sort of way. But I think he's just borrowing in order to convey a certain truth. I do think that here on Earth, that anything that we see or have experienced as a thing, that a more perfect thing probably, was conceived in heaven. I mean, we don't take something from nothing. We don't create something from nothing. I mean, God creates ex nihilo. He creates something from nothing, but we don't do that. We create something from something. Where did we get that idea to create something from something? So where did that come from? In what way might that be representative of heaven itself? And so by extension here, this artist, when he was on Earth, had the foresight and the capacity to see heaven bleeding through in the created order, to see God's fingerprints, dim as they are, and dimmed by our own vision, that he could capture glimpses of that and paint that and convey the glories of heaven through his paintings of the kinds of glories of heaven he saw bleed through into the world in which we live. Here he's saying, you say you want to paint this, but this is the model. There isn't anything here that can be improved upon. And all of us who are here see it as it really is, as it is perfectly created. There is no improvement. There's nothing to convey. We see the fullness of the beauty of heaven. And you, in your state right now, the Spirit is saying, still only see it partially. Maybe you see more than what we saw on Earth, but still you only see it partially. All of us who live in heaven see it in all of its fullness. And I would think that he would say, by extension, we see its glory. So I'm going to do this. So maybe I can try and finish this, because really I should break this up into 4 parts, but I do want to finish chapter 9. So I may go through this section just a little fast so that I can be done by 10. So then the artist goes on to say, then there's never going to be any point in painting here? I don't say that. When you've grown into a person, it's all right. We all had to do it. There'll be some things which you'll see better than anyone else. One of the things you will want to do will be to tell us about them, but not yet. At present, your business is to come see. He is endless. Come and feed. There was a little pause. That will be delightful, said the ghost presently in a rather dull voice. Come then, said the spirit, offering him his arm. How soon do you think I could begin painting? It asked. The spirit broke into laughter. Don't you see, you'll never paint at all, if that's all that you were thinking about, he said. So this is where you take something as seemingly as nice and as innocuous as painting, and that this ghost is obsessed with it, so obsessed with it that he can't see. So what he wants is this, the experience of painting, because he's become that, rather than seeing the very thing that inspires him to paint. And so his painting was an idol, and as an idol, it prevented him from seeing anything else. What do you mean? Asked the ghost. Why, if you are interested in the country only for the sake of painting, you will never learn to see the country. But that's just how a real artist is interested in the country. No, you're forgetting, said the spirit. That was not how you began. Light itself was your first love. You loved paint only as a means of telling about light. Oh, that's ages ago, said the ghost. One grows out of that. Of course, you haven't seen my later works. One becomes more and more interested in paint for its own sake. One does indeed. I've also had to recover from that. It was all a snare. Ink and catgut and paint were necessary down there, but they are also dangerous stimulants. So I'll give you another example. There are some people who love to read, and they love to read so much that they love books. And pretty soon all they do is collect books and organize their books and obsess over the books that they stop reading. So, excuse me. And so they stop reading. And when they stop reading, then they lose the purpose for books itself. But they love organizing, they love possessing, but they don't love reading. That's what happened to this painter. Every poet and musician and artist, but for grace, is drawn away from love of the thing he tells to love of the telling, till, down in deep hell, they cannot be interested in God at all, but only in what they say about him. So there are theologians and Bible teachers who are so interested in telling about God that the telling about God becomes an idol itself, and the presence of God and the person of God is forgotten. I think I've met people like that. For it doesn't stop at being interested in paint, you know. They sink lower, become interested in their own personalities, and then in nothing but their own reputations. I don't think I'm much troubled in that way, said the ghost stiffly, which means he really was. That's excellent, said the spirit. Not many of us had quite gotten over it when we first arrived. But if there is any of that inflammation left, it will be cured when you come to the fountain. What fountain is that? It's up there in the mountains, said the spirit, very cold and clear between two green hills. A little like Lethe. When you have drunk of it, you'll forget forever all the proprietorship of your works, all the ownership of your works. Those things will no longer be important to you. You enjoy them just as if they were someone else's, without pride, without modesty. That'll be grand, said the ghost, without enthusiasm. Well, come, said the spirit, and for a few paces he supported the hobbling shadow forward to the east. Of course, said the ghost, as if speaking to itself, there will always be interesting people to meet. Everyone will be interesting. Oh, yes, for sure. I was thinking of people in our own line. Shall I meet Claude or Sensei, or sooner or later, if they're here? But don't you know? Well, of course not. I've only been here a few years. Said the bright spirit, all the chances are against my having run across them. There are a good many of us, you know. But surely in the case of distinguished people you'd hear. But they aren't distinguished, no more than anyone else. Don't you understand? The glory flows into everyone and back from everyone like light in mirrors. But the light is the thing. Do you mean there are no famous men? They are all famous. They are all known, remembered, recognized by the only mind that can give perfect judgment. Oh, well, of course, in that sense, said the ghost. Don't stop, said the spirit, making to lead him still forward. One must be content with one's reputation among posterity, said the ghost. My friend, said the spirit, don't you know? Know what? That you and I are already completely forgotten on earth. What? What is that? Exclaimed the ghost, disengaging his arm. Do you mean those damned neo-regionalists have won after all? Lord love you, yes, said the spirit, once more shaking and shining with laughter. You couldn't get £5 for any picture of mine or even of yours in Europe or America today. They're dead out of fashion. I must be off at once, said the ghost. Let me go. Damn it all. One has one's duty to the future of art. I must go back to my friends. I must write an article. There must be a manifesto. We must start a periodical. We must have publicity. Let me go. This is beyond a joke. And without listening to the spirit's reply, the specter vanished. And so here, he concludes this chapter 9 with this example of a seemingly innocuous person who loved to paint, who apparently was pretty famous, who had forgotten the reason why he started to paint in the first place. And really what it was about was his reputation. It was his pride. And so when this spirit told him that he wasn't remembered more on earth, he just couldn't stand the thought of not being remembered. Not being remembered, and not being famous. So his love was for being famous. His love was not for having painted. And so he lost whatever was left of his humanity in that second, rejected heaven altogether for his own recognition and wanting to restore it. And then he just vanished. And there's another example of that later on. Later on in the chapters. So when we, some of the important takeaways of this last section would be all the different kinds of examples that Lewis provides about why people end up in hell. And the core, the essence of it is there's nothing left of the humanity. That fictionally speaking, that if there was anything left of the humanity in hell and they had a chance to go to heaven, what would they choose? And if they could let go of what sent them to hell, then what was left of their humanity could be brought to life. So this is not hard theology. This is a theory that Lewis is perpetuating. But again, I think there's something to that. I think that some people, even though they have experienced and participated in some of the wonders and glories of heaven here on earth, They just can't let go of what ultimately sends them to hell. And then what ultimately sends them to hell consumes what is left of the humanity. So there's nothing left to redeem. There's nothing left to restore. Nothing. They're just ashes. There's no ember. There's just ashes. And that's all that's left. And so he concludes with this, it was seemingly innocuous example of a person who just says that they like to paint. But in reality, they lost their love for painting long ago. And what they gained instead was their love for fame and notoriety. And so he was so determined that he just vanished and went back to hell. So next week we will do chapter 10. Chapter 9 is just so full of meaning, and as you can see why it's a pivotal chapter. So we will do chapter 10 next week, and I hope to see you then. So thank you very much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.